Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa salatu wa salamu ala Sayyidil Mursaleen. Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'een. Ma ba'd. This session, alhamdulillah, is an esteemed session. We have several Sharia scholars here, and we have the honor and privilege of asking them some hard questions, and perhaps to provide us with some advice and guidance for the Islamic finance sector in South Africa. And if we have some time, we may be able to open to the audience for any questions, inshallah. Mufti Faraz Adam, I'm going to go through them briefly because they have already been introduced. Mufti Faraz Adam is a well-known UK-based Islamic finance and fintech consultant. He heads the global Sharia advisory firm Amana Advisors, and he has been advising several global Islamic financial institutions through UK, US, Canada, Singapore, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and several other countries. Jazakumullah khair, Mufti Faraz. We have Shaykh Dr. Saeed Adekunde Mikail. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Dr. Mikail is currently a researcher at INSAF, Israel Research Management Center. He's an assistant professor at INSAF University and a registered Sharia advisor with the Securities Commission. He holds several Sharia board positions, and he is the chairman of the Sharia Committee of BNP Paribas. Moulana Bilal Jakhura is the director of the Center of Islamic Economics and Finance, South Africa. SIFSA is dedicated to the revival of Islamic economic and financial principles. He is also an industry captain. He is the CEO of Avenue Plastics and an Islamic scholar. And he has several degrees, mashallah, a BCom, bachelor's in accounting and auditing, an MBA. He is a certified Islamic professional accountant and an auditor and advisor, CPA, CSA, which is also the certified Sharia advisor and auditor. Mufti Abdul Barkatulla is a prominent Islamic Sharia law expert with background in social Muslim community work, economics and finance. He is trained extensively in Islamic and modern education systems in India and the UK. Mufti has contributed to the British Muslim community as an imam, a lecturer, a judge, Sharia judge, a developer of Islamic law information databases, an anchor of the community, and he is a media personality as well, and a Sharia advisor, of course, of Islamic banks and funds in Europe and Asia. Mufti Yusuf Sultan, who is a certified Sharia advisor and auditor from IOFI. He holds an MSc degree in Islamic finance from INSAF. He graduated as a Mufti in Sharia and Islamic jurisprudence from Jamia Sharia Manila in Bangladesh. And he also advises institutions in several countries, including Malaysia, Indonesia, and South Africa. Next is Mufti Mohammed Valli. Mufti Mohammed Valli is currently the head of Sharia at FNB Islamic Banking. He is an academic and a lecturer in Islamic jurisprudence and serves as a consultant and advisor in the field of Islamic banking and finance. He has extensive experience in accounting and auditing and governance for Islamic financial institutions. He has an MSc from the Global Islamic Finance University in Malaysia, and before that he completed his Alim Fadil and Iftar course at Darul Uloom Zakaria. Mufti Yusuf Suliman, he serves as the Sharia advisory head of and risk of Standard Bank. He also serves on numerous Sharia boards in South Africa and abroad. He developed the Islamic banking training material for all South African Islamic banks in this country, having been contracted by Bank CETA. He's also one of the few scholars in South Africa accredited with the CSAA from IOFI. He holds certificates in Qada, that's adjudication, from Imarat al-Sharia in Patna, Bihar in India, and he's completed Iftar at Darul Uloom Zakaria in Johannesburg, South Africa. I believe Mufti Ahmed Suliman is here. Thank you very much. Please join us on the stage. Mufti Ahmed is also a Sharia scholar of high repute in the Islamic banking, investments and insurance space. He served as Sharia advisor and board member on several financial institutions for the last 18 years, both inside and out of South Africa. He completed the BA, MA, RM program and thereafter completed the Iftar course at Darul Uloom Zakaria as well. And he has served as the Mufti of Jamiatul Ulama KZN and where he looked after the fatwa and judicial departments. He was a member of mediation and arbitration committee. So we have an exceptionally esteemed group of scholars, and before you have an opportunity to ask them questions, I would like to learn a little bit from them as well, and I'm going to be asking them some questions. But what we're going to do is, there are certain questions that may be open for the floor, and if there are any of the ulama that would like to answer that, please just raise your hand and feel free to answer that question. Whereas there will be other questions that will be more directed, and we will hope that the experts in that field, especially coming from the UK especially, perhaps can give us insights on that. So to begin with, the contemporary Sharia discourse is currently, outside South Africa at least, focusing on how social impact and sustainability criteria can become more pronounced in Sharia decision making. Now, there has always been a challenge of legal form versus substantive declaration. And there are several academic papers out there criticizing Islamic finance for focusing on form only, and saying that you need to go back to substance in order to avoid convergence with conventional finance. Otherwise, we can't tell the difference. So a concerted effort is now being made to measure or to establish criteria from the maqasidic approach, what you've studied on the SDGs and PDI, etc., but build that into Sharia decision making. Sustainability scorecards, for example, can create indicators that can guide financial institutions, particularly Islamic financial institutions, towards more responsible finance. So the first question would be, how do the scholars on the esteemed panel view this approach to move from a legalistic compliance set of checks to a broader impact-based set of criteria, bearing in mind that it is very subjective, and there is a lot of pressure from business to say that, is this the standardized approach? Are you going to allow or restrict for us what someone else has already allowed or restricted somewhere else? And this is a huge challenge. So I think perhaps if we could begin the discussion with perhaps Mufti Yusuf, Sultan, and if you could give us some views that you have on this.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Jazakumullah khairan, Shaykh Ziyaad. I think I would like to give a few perspectives into it, as Shaykh Ziyaad has mentioned that it's quite subjective, so putting into some more perspectives I think would be adding some value to it. First and foremost, if we look at the overall objective of Sharia law, if I want to summarize it in one single word, it's basically adl, to establish adl. Adl means justice, fairness, equity. So justice and fairness and equity with the Creator, within the human beings, with the nature, with the environment and everything. So this is where we get a broader maqasid Sharia point of view, where we want to basically eliminate harm. Sharia promotes to eliminate harm and bring benefits to human beings, to society, to environment. Now the modern discourse of sustainable investing or socially responsible investment, SRI, or ESG, SDG goals, etc., which have been circulated only a few years or decades, which roots back around the 17th centuries, starting from charge-based initiatives. We wanted to basically prohibit slave trading and some other unethical investing. Now, if we compare with the Sharia teachings, if we go back 14 centuries ago with the Quran and Sunnah, we see those messages were echoed in a much more comprehensive manner. If you look at the three broader criteria of SDG goals or ESGs, to basically protect the environment, to ensure social fairness and justice, and to ensure enhanced governance or proper governance, all those three aspects in a much more comprehensive manner has been addressed. Now the thing is, this is the very first thing that I wanted to share. Now the second one, which is basically tied to the first perspective as well, that since Sharia promotes most of those goals and criteria, if not all, as I was mentioning, there are numerous literature, and of course time would not allow me to go through it, to support those criteria and goals. Now, if we look from that perspective, Sharia definitely appreciate all such initiatives which echo the same message as well. There is no doubt in it. And Sharia would support in all ways all such initiatives it can. However, now the bigger question is, what Shaykh Ziyaad has posed to us, would those criteria be part of Sharia compliance checker or not? In other words, would the Sharia board consider those metrics, those scorecards, impact scorecards, as part of the Sharia compliance check process? Now, this one we need to look at what is the role of Sharia advisory board or overall Sharia governance. The main role is to ensure that the business activities or the products are halal, are not prohibited by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We see this has been mentioned and echoed in several verses of the Quran and also Sunnah. For example, in Surah Al-Baqarah, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Ya ayyuhan nas, kulu mimma fil ardi halalan tayyiban. Similarly, another verse, kulu min tayyibat ma razaqnakum. So it has been echoed in many verses that we should consume what is halal. Halal is defined by something, if we consume, then it's not taking us to any sinful act. So the opposite is haram. Now, if we look from Sharia board's role perspective, usually the role is basically to ensure that people are protected from consuming haram and they are going to halal. Now, if we consider this as a criteria to ensure halal, then what basically we are saying is that if those criteria are not matched, then it's haram. Then this poses us to another risk which Allah mentions, قُلْ أَرْأَيْتُمْ مَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهُ لَكُم مِّن رِزْقٍ فَجَعَلْتُم مِّنْهُ حَرَامًا وَحَلَالًا. That are you making some things halal or haram which Allah has prohibited? Now the thing is, what I would advocate for is basically, as I mentioned, Sharia promotes those things as well. In fact, in a much more broader, in a comprehensive manner. However, considering those as part of Sharia compliance check, I think would also be not the most productive way to do that. Rather, this is something that demands initiatives and due attention from all the stakeholders, cascading from the top to the bottom. Right? So it's a collective thing. If the institution, if the country, the regulator wants to promote that, definitely no Sharia issue, and that can sit on top of the base level Sharia check, and there would be no conflict at all. Thank you so much.
Okay, so you're saying that from the perspective of compliance, you need to stick to what is clear and does not have any debate. Whereas on top of that, you can always add as long as there is an understanding in the community, in the industry, as well as from the regulatory perspective, that is well managed. Otherwise, you'll have chaos.
Exactly.
Mufti Mohammed Valli, I think your experience is such that you're working in operations, you're coming from an academic background, a strong Sharia background, and reconciling that academia to operations, specifically within this first question context of sustainability practices. You've studied the SDGs, you've studied what's required as BDI in Malaysia, but how do you see that work out within the South African context, and particularly whether there should be separate Sharia criteria that should look at sustainability and whether it should be enforced?
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Doctor, for the question and for the opportunity. I think you hit the nail on the head when you said coming from an academic background, which is why sessions like these are so refreshing. Someone that is in the practitioner space now, being deprived of the front and cutting edge of academia, there's a deep resonance of conferences and such. It pushes, we know academia pushes frontiers, higher standard. And that is what objective of, I would assume, of conferences like these are. That to take us out of the comfort zone we're in as practitioners and to challenge ourselves to do better. It's an opportunity for muhasabah as a scholar in this, in the roles that we play, augmenting and supporting businesses that we do represent. What is our role? How are we supporting the industry at large? How are we being true to the integrity of our role? And what our deeper purpose is within such an environment. So I think from that perspective, as I sat there over the last 2 days, and if you allow me, I just want to just reflect on sustainability a bit before I answer your question, inshallah. Sustainability, to me, or as someone who's had the opportunity to work for the last few years in the South African Islamic banking industry context, has been very different to what has been explained and spoken about over the last few days. Sustainability was a struggle for survival in our context in the country, a struggle for relevance. We exist in a dual banking environment. We have no support or limited support from a regulatory perspective. There's no standards, there's no strategic documents, there's no PNM, although we love one, to be able to drive an agenda for us that allows us as Islamic banks to push the frontiers on certain issues like this. And then obviously the customer awareness drive, which has taken a while to get done, and the fact that we have 2% Muslim population, obviously we advocated far wider than that, but it's been getting our own customers over the line first. So in that type of context, for an Islamic bank, or some of us operating within Windows, it's been simply sustainability has been survived. And to that point, it's been trying to get us to a stage where we reach a legitimacy that our existence is legitimized, that people feel that it has a deserved space in the financial services environment in South Africa, to put us on an equal footing with the conventional, that we do have a product for every customer. There is a certain situation and financial need that needs to be fulfilled. And obviously, to create the necessary awareness so that we're not a niche anymore, and people regard us as a viable alternative. So that's been the effort over the last 20 years, and the individuals on stage, most of them are responsible, alhamdulillah, for a lot of that. And some sitting in the room, obviously, who deserve the credit for allowing us to pass that initial phase. Coming to sustainability, as it's been explained over the last 2 days, no doubt there's a space for it. It would resonate with everybody sitting on stage. We realize the need for us to take the next step. We realize the need for us to go beyond just the minimum approval of halal and to now move towards things that need to be better than just halal. And to move towards more impact-based instruments that are not dependent purely on compliance, but make a real difference and a material difference to the lives of the individuals who take up the product. So I think that resonates with all of us. And what is then, coming to your question, what is the challenge for scholars as we operate within this environment is how do we operationalize it? I know my colleague, Shaykh, Yusuf spoke to stakeholders getting involved. But again, I don't mean to harp on the contextual reality that we face, but I think it's important for context. South Africa doesn't have a regulator that's necessarily going to support this initiative. It's going to support it from a broad sector-based financial services view. But specifically within the Islamic space, there's not going to be anything specific decided for Islamic banking. It's almost going to have to be this driven at an institutional level with collaboration among the respective Islamic banks. And as we explained yesterday, or as was explained to us, it needs to be a culture change, more than just a strategic objective and something that we collaborate about. So I'm trying to apply some thought to answering your question prior to how, what would the role of a scholar be in pushing this next frontier? And then examining what Mufti Yusuf said with regards the role of a So Sharia is a function as scholars who are serving on Sharia boards and Sharia advisory committees, and it has internal Sharia functions. And what will the role of each scholar in that, in his specific job description be towards enabling what we're trying to achieve? If we purely leave it to the Sharia scholars who are sitting on the boards, we naturally see that it has been traditionally always beyond the ambit of Sharia scholars. They've not sought to get operationally involved or financially involved in the approval of a product. They would look at it from a pure legalistic perspective to see whether it met the master of compliance, and they would go from there. That was something they felt comfortable about. They would not want to be pushing a certain product because they felt it would have some operational or financial benefit for the institution. Asking them now to endorse a product on the basis of its environmental impact potentially could create issues for them. Number one. Number two, there's a skills gap and a shortage that we have to acknowledge. A scholar is comfortable in his space, which is the jurisprudential one. Is comfortable in terms of his interpretation of rulings, etc. Asking him now to perhaps survey an environmental report or a human rights abuse report and use that in informing his decision making around the Sharia compliance of a product, he might not have the necessary skills to be able to do that. There's practitioners and others who are able to do that. So there's naturally a skills shortage. There would also be different criteria that would take him out of his comfort zone that he might not be comfortable doing. So probably it needs to place the responsibilities squarely on a Sharia board or a Sharia scholar serving on a Sharia board would seem unfair. And in my opinion at least, I believe that it needs to be a more strategic, institutionalized thing, perhaps as governance, and this would be a proposal as you would find in the literature. We have governance committees that we've established within our respective banks. They have certain mandates. For example, the one I'm specifically involved in, there's a governance committee that looks at whether the deployment of the deposits we receive is done from a strategic perspective, from a Sharia perspective. Is it just used towards commodity murabaha, or is it a nice mix? Is it deployed towards assets? Is the liquidity managed appropriately? How do we deal with NPI, etc.? Those governance committees exist. And their role is to provide oversight in matters that the Sharia board, from a Sharia governance perspective, don't necessarily have the insight and the ability to do themselves. Sharia scholars and members of our board, or members of any Sharia board, as well as the internal Sharia function, can be a part of that process, and they should be a part of that process, to provide insights from a maqasid perspective with regards to BBI integration in the culture of this. But I mean, in terms of driving the culture, that should be the responsibility of the internal Sharia team. The external Sharia scholars that sit on the board should be responsible for creating awareness perhaps. They should be responsible for holding management to account in terms of these strategic objectives. There should be an accountability. There should be monitor the implementation as well of it. But in terms of driving the culture internally, perhaps it needs to be the role of the internal Sharia scholar rather than the Sharia board specifically. Number one. Number two, management should also take some responsibility, and they should be held to account by the governance committee with regards to integration, with regards to implementation of BBI. So there needs to be a mandate in terms of reference that's created, which is easily done in the normal governance committee. The relevant experts can be assembled and given the necessary mandates they need to sit in that committee to assist with the functioning of that committee. And strategically drive it from that perspective. I know I rambled a bit, but to answer your question specifically, I don't believe it's the responsibility exclusively of the Sharia board. I believe they have a role to play. I believe they need to be effectively utilized to achieve the objectives of BBI as we push the next frontier. And I believe the internal Sharia team plays a key role in that, in terms of driving the culture and creating relevance within management circles and the executive so that those decisions are made accordingly. I believe the Sharia committee should be left to deliberate on Sharia matters specifically, although they may ask questions with regards to BBI, but not conflate or blur the lines to them with as approving a product purely based on BVI criteria.
Before I move to the next question, is there any of the panel that would like to provide comments in 2 minutes? No.
I'd just like to say that I believe that Sharia compliance has to be there, right, from a legal perspective. But Sharia is wholesome. And what I mean by that is we have examples in Sharia where if the outcome is negative or detrimental, the ruling will be permissible. And I'll just give you 3 examples. Number 1, the scholars mentioned about Jumu'ah Salah, right? Transacting and trading at the time of Jumu'ah is not permissible. Even though the contract itself was in a Sharia compliant way, it's not permissible because it's unethical. Why is it unethical? It's clashing with your duty with Allah, right? That's the first example. Second example is developing a janab. If you have goods being imported into the city, even if the contract is Sharia compliant, but it's harming the people of the city, the scholars will mention this is makruh, not permissible, right? Because it's harm at the end of it. So even if the legals were there, we're taking a holistic view. And the third example, which someone just left in mind, let me pull it up, written an article on this. Yeah, making an offer of 2 parties have agreed in principle, right? So if me and my brother have agreed to a contract, another person can't come and interject and make an offer, even though our contract is Sharia compliant. So I believe Sharia is wholesome. It includes all of these things. We need to go from Sharia compliance to Sharia governance or Sharia experience. Compliance is just the legals, the contract. It's just the paper, the process. But the way you implement the Sharia has to also be Sharia compliant. And that's basically behavior, how you behave, what you do. And that's why we have auditing. When we do Sharia audit, we're not looking at if the contract is written in a Sharia compliant way. It's more than that. How was it implemented? Because that's another element of Sharia governance and compliance. So just to wrap up, it's all of it together, compliance plus experience.
Yeah.
Dr. Ziyaad, you mentioned, and it caught my ear, that you're going to ask us some very hard questions.
Only warming up.
No, I don't mean a hard question. I mean we are going to make your life harder because if you think 1.5 hours enough for the session, I don't think so. The point I want to make, or actually make a point, is you put 2 scholars in a room, you're going to get the sense of opinion. You had the guts to put 7 scholars in the room on one platform. Including yourself, 8. I look at it somewhat different to what my colleagues have all mentioned. See, when we're judging a contract or a product for Sharia compliance purposes, then where do we get our rules from? We spoke about legal. Where do we get our rules from? So we get our rules from Quran, Sunnah, the whole flow of how we get our contract. But somewhere along the line there is a place and position for ijma, and a place and position for something a little bit less than ijma, but we speak about al-maslahat al-amma, and we speak about so many other things, right? Without going into the detail of all of that, that may also be part of the contract. So when you're looking at a legal agreement, and we're judging the legal agreement for Sharia compliance purposes, for example, take a Murabaha agreement. You can study a Murabaha agreement, and you can get best scholars and the best lawyers to write that Murabaha agreement, and we can make sure that the process is followed, but the item that's been sold on Murabaha is wine. It will never make it Sharia compliant, right? Why? Because although the legals are correct, there is juristic text that would make the item being sold as haram and non-compliant. This is on the highest level, giving the previous example to explain the point of getting. Sometimes you'll go lower, one step lower, to make the item that's being sold, for example, may not be prohibited through the hadith or through the Quran, but maybe through some other means. And that's where collective input comes into play. So, for example, you may have a particular deal on the table or a particular transaction on the table that may not be good for the environment. It may not be good for the general community. It may have certain social disadvantages. When you're looking at the legal contract, it may be okay. But when you're looking at the holistic view, it may be not okay, and it's a Sharia judgment of it not being okay, and it's outside the legal. So by extension of this concept, it could become the role of Sharia scholars to extend this Sultan. وَإِن مِّن شَيْءٍ إِلَّا عِندَنَا خَزَائِنُهُ وَمَا نُنَزِّلُهُ إِلَّا بِقَدَرٍ مَعْلُومٍ. I'm not saying we have the knowledge of everything, but the information and the knowledge that we have, we set it down in terms of that. Right? What we know today in terms of our environment, maybe we didn't know 10 years ago, maybe we didn't. So today we say coal, oil, we say coal is bad for us, like the noise, but maybe solar is good for us. 20 years down the line, somebody may come up and say, no, solar is not good because of this reason, whatever it is. I'm not saying we mustn't go for solar. What I'm saying is that at a point in time, scholars will collectively understand and agree why we could or couldn't go into certain contracts based on either, like Mufti Yusuf mentioned, about a regulator. The regulator obviously having the status of argument, imposing certain things. But sometimes it's not from the regulator side, it's from al-maslahat al-amma side, where the scholars could collectively or by majority agree that something is not good for the community. And I take an example, and if I'm not, I think it comes from Malaysia, where certain credit card contracts are not allowed because of the harms it has to society. So if you look at the contract, it's fine. But the social harm aspect has led to scholars saying we won't allow a credit card to this type of segment of society.
I'm going to stop that question for now. We're going to move on to the next. Just one or two points as a summary, and one of the reasons why we've asked this question. The reality is that Sharia scholars are already talking about this as part of the criteria of compliance. And we brought it into context, and of course we appreciate what Mohammed mentioned. The context of South Africa may be challenging. However, much of the screening process of what we have through DJII, or FTSE Islamic, or IOP, have been established through ijtihad. So if that has been established through ijtihad and we fall back on regulation, then we will never move forward. In fact, we've really been caught out in the cold because we've been talking about ethical stocks and ethical shares before anyone else was. But we stayed there with the same criteria for 20 years. We didn't move, and ESG SRI came over, and we now became a subset of ESG and SRI, whereas we were the umbrella. So the point of this discourse is to raise awareness that it's happening. Whether we like it or not, it is happening. It's just that whether we are ready to have that discussion here in South Africa, or in the UK, or in Nigeria, or in other countries, to start, actually dissipating or disseminating that idea through to the rest of the Sharia boards and the banks. And agreed, it's always a holistic approach. It's never the Sharia board alone. But as you've heard over the last 2 days, it's happening around us. It's already happening. And now the Sharia scholars need to, they need to play their part. But with regard to the example, that is an open example in Malaysia. In fact, Malaysia is at a stage now where compliance is really an issue because they have achieved maturity. They know what they are allowed to do. And the majority of the opinions are based on, does this really cause harm? And that's the question the Sharia scholars are asking. And when we present it with a product, and if it's for wealth management, and it's for the wealthy, then the question is not whether it's compliant or not. It's whether you have an alternate product for the other end of the community to balance your wealth product. And that's how the bankers are presenting products these days. So compliance is something that they've already understood. I understand that we are still going through the process here in South Africa, but 20 years, or since 1989, that's not very far off from Malaysia that started off in 1983. And that's long before, countries like Nigeria that have an SRI Sukuk criteria. Now, in fact, my next question is to you, Shaykh.
No, I just want to say that I support the views that have been expressed, but just to clarify, it shouldn't be understood as there isn't support for the whole sustainability perspective. I think we're talking about degrees of excellence. It's like everyone sitting here would hope to be the most excellent in whatever they do. Or every bank that's doing a deal would love to be giving those funds to the customer with the highest level of criteria. Right? But is it possible in every single circumstance? So it's about choices, and those choices start right from the entrepreneur. When he's choosing how to allocate his scarce capital between two projects, like we discussed yesterday, which project does he choose? Then it goes to the next level, that those that are deploying the capital of the masses, when they are presented with scarce choices. And that's something also which I feel that Islamic financial institutions sit with surplus capital, which is something to think about. That's what should be part of the sustainability discussion. That how much of that capital is actually reaching down to where it should reach. So I just wanted to emphasize it's about degrees of excellence, and I don't think any scholar sitting here or anywhere in the world would object to us reaching the highest levels of excellence in whatever we do.
It is an issue of ihsan, it is an issue of excellence. And the VBI initiative and the VBIT initiatives, when we began drafting both those frameworks, it was because we wanted to move up into the degrees of excellence. That's why it was structured. And in fact, it was the driver for the entire financial sector, not just Islamic. But I think that brings me on to the question about a very important segment of the community, and that's our entrepreneurs. Our entrepreneurs have a lot of difficulty acquiring finance, especially the nano, the micro, the small business entrepreneurs. And Islamic banks have a responsibility to their depositors and their shareholders. So therefore, there is a very detailed creditworthiness check. And when I was back home here in South Africa, family would often say, I went to the bank and they rejected my finance. They want my grandfather's blood type before they can consider it. That was the big argument. So when sustainability practices like VBI were implemented, they emphasized as the number one driver, the entrepreneurial mindset being driven through the Islamic financial institution. So this is the question. Do we have adequate products and services available at Islamic financial institutions that support that level of entrepreneurs that don't have a credit history, they don't have business plans, they don't have a track record, and they need some support beyond funding?
When we speak about the instruments, the products as it were, that are available, I think what we have available caters, Muraba transactions, we've done a broad array of assets, right? So from that perspective, I think it goes down to the policies, especially from a credit perspective, right? The willingness to take risk, and perhaps banks, and our Islamic banks in particular, one can understand. Again, it's about excellence. They have a responsibility to the deposit base, but perhaps there should be some portion of the funds that are demarcated for taking larger than the standard risk in terms of the standard credit criteria that's there. But there may be, for example, the lowering of the bar to a degree. Because again, we also don't want a situation where Islamic financial institutions are deemed to be more risky. That doesn't serve anyone. So there needs to be a balance, but there may be opportunities. For example, if you look at the tech side of things, the whole app development, entrepreneurs looking to go in, the potential for growth in that area. So it could be traded off against a higher return potentially, but lowering the bar in order to be able. So that's the one thing I feel. The second Because I feel also communication, right? So when an entrepreneur has been refused, then just to give them the feedback in detail, I've seen that that feedback can sometimes be, it's purely because they may not be well known enough, or they may, but does the business plan make sense? It may require investment of resources on the side of the bank. But yes, at the end of the day, whether you are an entrepreneur or you're in a bank or you're in business, you go put a product before a customer and you're not excellent, you're not meeting what the market requires, then you will get rejected, and it's something that you're going to be prepared for. But yes, because of entrepreneurship being such an important thing, definitely there can be some policies that are developed to accommodate, like lowering the credit requirements, things like, for example, a track record. I mean, it's crazy if you look right now in some of the sort of just digress for a second here. There's a whole number of engineers that have graduated in the last 2 years, right? But most of the engineering jobs in South Africa are demanding experience. So where do those engineers go? I've personally come across engineers that are working in cell phone stores at close to minimum wage. So those sort of things, those vicious circle type policies, that's what we need to do.
Exactly. I think that from a pure Sharia perspective, are there Sharia issues, Mufti Yusuf, that may be restricting the development of such products? Are there any Sharia issues, or is it just a purely an operational issue? Mufti Yusuf,
I was trying to get away to use it Sultan.
You are a businessman, so therefore, you have experience on both sides.
So I think it's quite heartwarming to see so many Sharia scholars on the stage. I thought it's a photo shoot for me, so that's why I'm here. But I think there's a few factors. There are people from Centre that were part of the conference. I'm not sure if they're here or not. They were running an excellent entrepreneurship program. And if you look at the stats within South Africa, I haven't done research on the stats, but I understand that they do have some research at hand because I participated in one of the previous awards functions, and they did some stats around the success of entrepreneurs within the South African market. And one of the key reasons why entrepreneurs fail is because of lack of education, the lack of ability to put together a proper business plan, and the lack of operationalization of that particular plan in a proper manner. So Sansa had an excellent program where not only did they teach entrepreneurship, but they also funded the individuals that required funding for those particular programs. But coming back to the question I would ask is, where does the responsibility of this lie? One is the educational side, which is definitely imperative, but credit, we know, is religion agnostic. So in essence, when a bank looks at a particular customer coming to its stores, irrespective of the religion, the credit criteria will be exactly the same. I mean, we see it in many Islamic banks. You don't need a separate credit division to do a credit check on a customer, because the very same credit checks will be done on a conventional and on an Islamic banking customer. So the question then begs as to whether banks are comfortable to assume credit risk of entrepreneurs walking through the doors. And we know that from our experience, we know that banks are not necessarily geared up for the credit risk. Yes, you would have other, and by assuming additional risk, you add on to the capital requirements of the bank, you add on to other challenges of the bank. And we know that risk mitigation is one of the important elements within any banking structure. So coming back to our solution, I would say that entrepreneurship and development of entrepreneurship doesn't lie within, it lies within Islamic financial institutions, but not within the Islamic banking sector. It's like asking a Takaful company to fund an entrepreneur. It's not going to happen. I would say the solution lies in 3 or 4 different areas. The first area where the solution lies is in private equity funding. We need to see, we haven't seen a formal private equity fund within the South African market that deals specifically on Sharia funding for private equities. We don't have one, and there's an opportunity for the business people out there. We don't have one venture capital that is a company that is Sharia compliant in South Africa. Again, we need venture capital companies that can support us. The third is unsecured lending. So unsecured lending or unsecured financing will be done generally in utilizing a wakala structure. And if we utilize a wakala structure, the question is which organization or institution will be comfortable to fund in an unsecured manner an entrepreneur. We have seen one organization, I'm not going to go into details of the structure, but they've put together a decent structure for unsecured funding on a wakala basis for startup businesses. And they've done something very clever when it comes to one of the questions that we're going to speak about fintech. What they've done was, they said we will fund you a specific amount and we will recoup our capital and profit through your POS machine, through your point of sale machine. So on your daily turnover, whatever you gain from your daily turnover, a percentage of that will be utilized to pay us back the profit and capital. So it lends to two or three benefits. One, the payback is based on turnover. It's not that the customer entrepreneur is required to pay more than they are earning. So that's one important aspect. Because many times entrepreneurs go into contracts and they can't sustain because of certain challenges in terms of turnover, etc. The second benefit of this is it's unsecured, it's on a wakala basis, and then obviously the manner in which they've done this can be utilized for franchising, etc. So if you look at when we talk of asset-based financing, and I'm in with all with this, one of the biggest challenges that entrepreneurs have, an entrepreneur will come to a bank and say, I want funding for my franchise. We know that goodwill or intangible assets are a big component of the funding. The bank is comfortable to fund the asset element of it, but not comfortable to fund the intangible asset element of it. Because we say that can we use murabaha, we can't use murabaha, what other structures? So these are the Sharia impediments that have to be noted for the development of entrepreneurship in the country. But I think that the responsibility lies not necessarily only with Islamic banks, but private equity, venture capital, and unsecured lending firms need to come up with solutions for this.
Jazakallah khair. I think that's very important. And when we're looking at this, first of all, it's not whether these issues lie as a responsibility of Sharia scholars or lie within the responsibility of any specific institution, but it's to understand the impediments that have been delaying the progress of this specific sector. And perhaps, and it's also to share a bit of experience that outside you've got specific institutions like BMT in Indonesia, Baitul Mal wa Tanweer, that have developed their own ecosystem from beginning to end, identifying the person who is the poorest of the poor and lifting him up phase by phase. As Mufti Faraz mentioned, why don't we have a kind of structure? They have that structure to such a degree that they will lift you up into a stage where you are now able to acquire commercial funding. Whereas yesterday you couldn't put food on the table. And this is happening. We've been involved in several projects in Indonesia and we've seen it firsthand. If you go throughout, Bangladesh has the excellent approach of the IBDL and the RDS or the RDI scheme. And in Pakistan, the NRSP that we've worked with was an NGO that builds entrepreneurs with charity and then moves them into the bank where it's commercial. So there is this synergy. And I think what we want to get out of this is to understand it's not one institutional responsibility alone. It's to ensure that the collaboration is there so that there is a graduation of poverty from those that cannot afford, so that ultimately they are empowered and they can support those that come behind them. I'm going to move over to the next question unless anyone else, any of the ulama would like to provide any further comments. The next question is still within the context of South Africa, and broadly we've just tried to highlight some of the key issues that we've been hearing about. The third is about the capital market scenario. And you've got so many banks, windows, you've got one fully fledged, you've got the careful asset managers, all trying to manage a significant amount of liquidity. And knowing from way back then, from the Al-Barakah perspective, liquidity was a major issue. And it's strange that conventional banks have difficulty understanding this. It's not shortage, it's excess of liquidity. We just have too much money. We don't know where to place it, and that's because there aren't adequate instruments. And that's a huge problem. Is that problem still evident in South Africa? That's the first part. Do we need, and we've had a sukuk, alhamdulillah, that was issued, do we need rand-based sukuk? What are the impediments in the launching of such types of sukuk? What can be done? I think that's the idea, to understand the gap in the Islamic capital market, particularly from the sukuk perspective. I'm going to start here with Shaykh Ahmed. Yeah.
I have to be careful what I say, because I think some of what I know is privileged information, so I can't say everything that I know. But what I can say is that the South African government sovereign is working on a rand-based book, and we hope that in this year, 2022, we hope that we'll see. It is a challenge. You spoke about the challenge. The challenge is there. The challenge is great. The challenge is multiplying every day. The sukuk that will be introduced by the sovereign will not be sufficient to cover the entire problem. Will be there. There are other institutions, government stakeholders that are looking at some sukuk as well. We have some of our own problems in South Africa, which is in the media, not related to Islamic banking, but those problems will hold us back. And until and unless we can't resolve some of those issues, we will not be able to it will be difficult to put Islamic banking or Islamic finance products into those systems. That's a quick answer.
Yes, it's a very cautious and safe answer. Well done. I think what we're trying to understand is, we are now in 2022. How many rand-based sukuk have been issued? Now,
So to my knowledge, from the sovereign, we have no rand-based sukuk. We have $1 sukuk that I think is up to maturity also anytime soon. It doesn't yet mature. It's mature, right? So we had the dollar-based sukuk, and now we're going to the.
so the dollar-based sukuk was issued in 2014 at $500 million. It was a major milestone, not for South Africa, but for the whole of Africa. But the question is, are there Sharia issues, perhaps together with legislation, perhaps maybe tax issues, that impede the progress of sukuk, broader sukuk issuance, and perhaps rand-based sukuk issues?
So one of the problems is the way the assets of the sovereign sit in South Africa. That makes it difficult to get a big value base of assets into one pool, because the assets of various government departments are put in the central position of the state. That's one of the challenges. The other challenge was, understanding, and this was a Sharia challenge, probably I would say, that had to be overcome, and I think by now most of us have overcome this, was the understanding of hukuk and the sale of hukuk and the renting out. Hukuk means right. So the sale of intangibles, the sale of a right, the leasing out of a subsequent right that has been bought. So I buy the right of use from you, I buy the haq, and then I lease it out back to you. So I continue owning it, but using it, we have the right to use. That was one issue that came up. It came up negatively. When it came up negatively, the government of South Africa did not take kindly to it, because they didn't know, if and we have to be fair to them, right? If you have national treasury here as the audience, and they start asking each and every one of us sitting on the stage, and all give different opinions, they don't understand the technicalities of how a Sharia scholar gets to an opinion, right? They need one answer. And if we're going to give them 10 different answers, it's going to make it difficult. And that definitely, National Treasury, in one of our meetings with them, did raise it.
That's an important point, and perhaps something that's coming out of here is that a lot more collaboration is required. And before putting up a phase to National Treasury, perhaps, there needs to be a concerted effort behind closed doors to ensure that there's one clear approach and decision. I know that's not very easy because scholars are all over the country, access, etc., timing, context is always an issue.
But to solve for that, we tried solving for that before National Treasury raised it. But that's because it came up in the session as well, so probably not marketed well. Scholars don't have marketing degrees, they don't market themselves well. But we have established something called Al-Ittihad Al-Am. This was the name given to the organization, our late Shaykh Carr, الاتحاد العام لأعضاء هيئات الرقابة الشرعية. Assoc. We have some of the members here of Association of Sharia Advisory Committee members, and we have this association basically is not open for all scholars of the country to become a member. One of the criteria is that for you to be a Sharia board member, someone has the name suggests. A lot of work was done in some of the areas. I think there's more work than the organization can still going to be doing. Probably one of the things we need to establish for that organization is probably a marketing arm.
That's an important point. Yeah. I think that's an important point. The issue is that outside you have a cross-disciplinary relationship, meaning that Sharia scholars rely on those with other skills to assist them in marketing or finance or auditing. That's why Sharia boards outside, as you know, in Malaysia, a 5-member board would have 3 Sharia scholars and 2 experts with Sharia background, but not scholars. But they would then provide the business perspective, the marketing perspective. And it may be a consideration of, just to expand that circle. And of course, perhaps limiting it to only Sharia scholars that are sitting on boards will now just concentrate the Sharia scholars that are sitting on boards to all other boards as well. That's just an observation. I think, check it out, please.
I just want to say, I think there's an opportunity for Islamic financial institutions as part of this, that we don't only focus on the sovereign sukuk side. There's an opportunity to offer bespoke Islamic financial solutions to large corporates, let's say the JSE, some of the JSE listed companies. That needs to be, typically we would wait for the request to come in from the general customer base. But I think Islamic finance needs to go out and say, this is a product we can't offer you, because it would then meet the credit criteria, hopefully, and allow them to have greater participation in the real economy. See, another term, sometimes the word sukuk is being used in use. So when you said that sukuk, how many rand-based sukuk, some of the conduits are being referred to as sukuk. So let's all be on the same page, that when we say sukuk, we say sukuk where the funds are reaching the real economy. That's where it's going to make a difference. So I think the opportunity is for Islamic financial institutions, perhaps even funds, even some of them, I don't know what's the regulatory implications of that, but I'm sure some of them can issue, for example, Islamic commercial paper. You don't have to use the word sukuk, because that might just, scare them with the types of legal fees that are involved. But as far as the opportunity to fund outwardly what may be an agnostic, not a specific requirement of that corporate. Let's say, for example, a Sasol or Anglo-American, any business that's involved in Sharia compliant co-activity could potentially be funded by the Islamic finance. That's an opportunity.
Very good point. Now,
yeah. Just want to add some point with regard to sukuk, why
the focus is here is on sovereign sukuk. I think when we look at the Malaysian environment, so the sukuk market in Malaysia is driven by corporate sukuk, not sovereign sukuk. So, and if you look at even Nigeria also, so there is now several issues of corporate sukuk in Nigeria. In fact, apart from being a corporate sukuk, it's not even listed one, it's private placement. So it is easy for the corporate to just buy into the sukuk instead of waiting for large subscribers of the public, because that requires a lot of security in order to ensure that the sukuk issuer or the originator pays back, but especially from the rating point of view. You said you are going to pay on so date, so how are you going to make the payment? So that's why that is they are very strict in that. So another point I would like to highlight is that with regard to sovereign sukuk, it always attracts the issue of asset-based sukuk, because the sovereign asset is not meant to be sold to sukuk holders. So whereby the government still wants the asset to be placed with them. And there is a lot of views from the scholar with regard to the permissibility of asset-based sukuk. And I think the issue from my point of view, also point of view, there are views, there is two riwayah from Imam Ahmed, especially the second riwayah is the riwayah that the scholar in Hanbali school of thought used to apply when it comes to financial transaction. And in fact, even Ibn Taymiyyah, when he wanted to make preference, he made preference based on the second riwayah of Imam Ahmed. Because they say that there is insijan, coherence between the evidence, either from the Quran or the Sunnah, and the practical approach. So the reality on ground. So that's why they prefer that riwayah. And on that riwayah, Imam Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn Qayyim, they allow, if there is any condition, because this is one of the major issues with regard to asset-based sukuk, there is a condition that you have to sell it back to the issuer or the originator. And they say that that condition restricts the ownership of the sukuk issuer. And when the ownership is restricted, it makes the contract, especially when we are talking about sale contract, invalid. But Ibn Taymiyyah and his students, Ibn Qayyim, they say that is not the case. Because it doesn't mean that, it doesn't say you should not sell it. It said if you want to sell it based on the market value to me. And they say that there is no difference between selling it to third party and selling it to the seller. And they justify it based on there is hadith. And they practice from the companion of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. And I mentioned that in one of the articles that I wrote with regard to the ownership, milkiyah, and its implication in sukuk. So that hadith gives the basis to the opinion of Imam Ahmed. And you know the principle of Imam Ahmed, whenever there is any after, all the Sahabi, it will take it. So, and that is the basis for that. And they justify it that this is not an incongruence with Maqsood of an Aqd. Because Maqsood of Aqd is to transfer the ownership. And the ownership has been perfectly transferred. So, that is one point from Sharia point of view. And another point, if you want to look at the need, haja, specific need of the nation is in need of liquidity. So, that I don't think that itself should be the main issue that we disapprove the product. So actually, we can restrict it just like approach of IOFI with regard to tawarruk. IOFI does not allow tawarruk, but they allow tawarruk if Islamic financial institution is facing systemic risk to use tawarruk. So this is just for the need, but there is haja muta'addila. And you know that al-haja tanzilu manzilat al-darura. So I think that this is one of the way to look into the aspect of solving sukuk in order to get rid of this kind of offside.
Shaykh Mohammed wants to say something.
Just to respond to Shaykh Mikail, there is a restriction, unfortunately, from a legislative perspective around issuance of sukuk by non-listed entities. So that in terms of the tax treatment, unfortunately, the way the regulations have been drafted, the sovereign is able to issue, a listed entity is able to issue, any public entity meaning linked to government. But in terms of non-listed entities issuing sukuk, unfortunately, the tax treatment won't be the same, which is probably a standard law locally. Not to say the point isn't valid. I mean, we've got that unfortunate consideration to make. Number one. Number two is the point about IOFI is also very valid because in the recent discussion we've had, some of the questions that we've received is we need to have a sukuk instrument that's tradable on a global perspective. So when we want to take into account maslaha of the country from a liquidity perspective of a hajj of the country, for example, we might see in a certain structure suitable to achieve our need that we need to fulfill. The context is that we need an instrument that is tradable on a global level, which then obviously then has to conform to IOP criteria because many banks and asset managers internationally will use that as a criteria. So it's a challenge for us locally to be able to provide the comfort to the necessary stakeholders that that instrument will be acceptable. So there's certain internal challenges in the points of that.
I'm going to switch gear a little bit here. We're going to move into issues and potential solutions that have arisen outside South Africa, but also minority communities. We have Mufti Barkatulla, but also have Mufti Faraz. And from a UK and Canadian context, I think it's very important to understand how some of those challenges have been overcome and what challenges they were. Are they similar challenges, Mufti Barkatulla? Perhaps the question first, Mufti Barkatulla. What challenges have they faced in terms of Sharia implementation for Islamic finance, and how have they remained functional and compliant within their secular environments?
Thank you for that, for raising this concern. Of course, we have learned extensively about the local situation, but we can always learn from other jurisdictions' experience, inshallah. So UK, being a global power, historically, they are very prudent in terms of business approach and in terms of interpreting legally. So the Bank of England's governor and Financial Services Authority's chairman, they say for Islamic finance, we never bend any rule. And we just reinterpreted the rule to suit the Islamic finance. So for instance, instead of Islamic finance, they call it alternative financial arrangement. That is a fair, acceptable for Muslims also. Apart from the benchmark of interest and other things, you can have similar economic functional criteria and terms and conditions which will serve the financial parties related to this. So, but the story is a little bit some emotional also that because of their global experience, the Bank of England's governor personally, he took interest to put a committee of 7 members, Treasury, Tax, Bank of England, Muslim community, lawyer community, 7 committee members who sat down and examined all the hurdles. Yeah? And then they suggested some changes, some adjustment, and from 2002 to 2008, every year, Financial Services Act was amended to accommodate that in the Parliament. If you see the Parliament proceeding, you will find my name and other names who did this effort. So they just tweaked and adjusted this alternative financial arrangement, and the reason for political decision, first of all, there has to be political will, because economy is connected with political decision making. So lobbying, and fortunately for the Muslim community, the Labour government was in the power at that time for 2-3 terms, and there's also Prime Minister and the Chancellor, Bank of England, everybody said, okay, we want to attract the Gulf capital and make it the European hub of Islamic finance. And for that grandiose purpose, they reinterpreted rules. So for instance, the deposit guarantee for the banks, they did not change the rule. Sharia board had a lot of discussion with the Financial Conduct Authority and the Bank of England. They said, we are not going to change the rule. You accommodate doing this because there are hundreds of other banks. We cannot relax the rule of the deposit guarantee. Yeah? So the Sharia scholars really, after a long discussion, they brought up a solution which is on their website. This is one. The other one is that after they approved the first Islamic bank in 2002 or 3, then the whole of like 27 European countries and the rest of the world, they were surprised. So the Financial Conduct Authority, Mikail, he said, oh, we were in high demand to explain to the world how are we adjusting the Islamic finance here in our economy. So Alhamdulillah, they took a pride, they took a decision, and the government was sympathetic, and Muslim lobbying, Muslim Council of Britain was lobbying heavily, and that was successful. And there was a market and there was a ready taker, Muslims and non-Muslims. Yeah? So the shareholders were non-Muslims for Islamic Bank. The first account ever opened was non-Muslim, and still I know, I've been the advisor for Islamic Bank of Britain. There are like 20% still non-Muslim customers. They are happy with it. So, as one of the consultants says that Islamic finance does not have to be expensive or exotic. It should be financially viable and acceptable as an ethical value for Muslims and non-Muslims alike. That is the acid test. And if Sharia scholars, if the secular jurisdictions are reinterpreting the rule in a prudential manner to accommodate the minority needs, we, Alhamdulillah, we Islamic Sharia scholars also are reinterpreting Sharia in terms of reality, in terms of the constraints, in terms of the like we are 2, 3, 4% of the population. We cannot dictate our terms on the 95% of the population. So that's why there is always give and take and compromise, but there are limits and there are things, and Alhamdulillah, this is working very, very well. And there is a small story that Muslims who generally the owner-occupier ratio in UK is very high. So the Bank of England governor, his neighbor was a Muslim family. And when they signed the mortgage contract to buy their own house, they were not happy. They were sad and that day because they had no choice. This was like around year 2000. So he being a neighbor, he was really emotionally also, he asked them why you are sad, because he had to sign a buy agreement. He said, I am a Bank of England governor. How can be a similar need of all human beings cannot be accommodated with you? So that was he said, no, we have the authority and we have the ways and means to adjust according to whatever is your faith and your belief. Alhamdulillah, he made really 3 or 4 years of effort behind the scene. So there are some, like, mashallah, maybe some duas, other people, because halal and haram food we are very, very particular, but in finances we are always getting the exemptions. So that's fine, alhamdulillah, with the will and with the experience of US and Canada and UK. The speed is very slow in Canada, and in United States is also very slow and very low level. But in UK, alhamdulillah, Islamic finance was growing for last decade, but after the financial crisis, it has stabilized now. There are 20 banks and 100 Sharia consultancy legal firms who are serving not just the UK but the globe. So alhamdulillah, there is a good story to tell and share. And the sovereign sukuk was issued by the government, UK government twice, just to give the industry a green line that they can issue, the corporate, they can issue their own sukuk. Okay, let's hope that it is replicable.
Inshallah, inshallah. Jazakallah khair. Mufti Faraz, perhaps you have nothing to add from that.
He did very well.
Perhaps Dr. Saeed, you spoke about Sharia governance yesterday. Perhaps maybe if you could share, based on your experience in Malaysia, Nigeria, and other parts of the world, and of course your academic experience on Sharia governance, what would you say would be some advice for the South African market, Islamic financial market, specifically on the Sharia issues, Sharia scholars, Sharia governance structures? What would be your advice to the market?
With regard to Sharia governance, I think I would like to look at it from the IFSB, because there is joint Sharia governance framework between IFSB and IOQ. So they try to synergize between the previous Sharia governance requirements of IOP and also that of IFSB, in order to set what are the requirements for Sharia governance framework. And from there, they lay emphasis on the need for Islamic financial institutions to ensure that is adequate and effective Sharia governance framework in place. For what? In order to ensure Sharia compliance of their business operation services and their affairs. So, coming from this perspective, so there is a need for collaborative from the leaders in each Islamic financial institution. I'm talking of board of directors, senior management, and Sharia committee. They need to work together in order to ensure the compliance of their operation, because the compliance with the Sharia is a defined requirement. It's also a statutory requirement and regulatory requirement in some jurisdiction. So it's not a matter of choice. So that's why we have to work together. So, and this is the approach in GCC country. And even though they have a different approach there in terms of having Sharia requirements at regulatory level without having Sharia committee at central bank level. So just like what we have here in South Africa. For example, in Kuwait, there is no central Sharia body, but they have Institute of Al-Qam, which is looking into Islamic affairs in general. So they have their own resolution that is also binding on Islamic financial institutions. So, but in the case of South Africa, I think the best approach could have been if we have regulatory support. But as Shaykh mentioned that regulatory support require political will. So that's why we need to work on that. So, but at the moment, so we can also try at our own best level to ensure that at institutional level we have Sharia committee with the support of the management and board of directors. And also within the institution also, we have to ensure that there is internal Sharia control in place in order to ensure that there is a continuous review of Sharia compliance of the operation of Islamic financial institution. So in addition to that, so we can also leverage on Sharia standard of IOFI. So meaning that all the requirements of standard of IOFI will be complied with. So just as what we have in Nigeria, apart from having a central Sharia body, but the IOFI Sharia standard is compulsory. It's not a matter of choice, unlike there in Malaysia. In Malaysia, IOFI Sharia standard is just a reference. There is no binding effect on Islamic financial institution with regard to IOFI, and also including even financial accounting of IOFI. So it's not binding upon them. So, but we can also try to leverage on that in order to ensure that Sharia compliance has been taken care of. I think that is something very important to ensure that we follow the best practice approach with regard to Sharia compliance.
That's excellent advice. We have a few minutes left. We have 5 minutes, 10 minutes. We have 10 minutes for questions from the audience with the Commission of the Moulana. Questions from the audience? No.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. I may not have questions, but I'm going to take a few liberties, inshallah, if you allow me, for a few minutes. One, I think a lot of the questions that were posed were actually not scholarly questions, Mark, it's just feedback and business problems. And I think these questions should have been posed to the business practitioners rather than to our scholars. I think on the topic of contemporary issues in Islamic finance with scholars, I would have much rather hear permissibility of tawaddud rather than legislative amendments required. The second part that I want to say is, I think it's great to speak about GCC and Malaysia as aspirational targets. You can't compare Kaizer Chiefs to Manchester United. You have to compare apples to apples. And I think that's a very important consideration, right? Okay. I think it's important to understand that context, right? That we are 2% population. And as practitioners, what I want to do is I want to actually show appreciation to our legislator. I want to show appreciation to our regulators. Because even though we are a minority of a minority group in South Africa, we still have formal recognition from the Prudential Authority, from the Regulatory Authority, and from the Tax Authority in our legislation. So I think it's important to identify that you cannot compare 2% minority population to 68% majority population with two central banks, one being an Islamic central bank. So it's a very important consideration that I think needed to come out. Two last points from me is we always know that there is this concept of academia and business practitioner, and I think it's important for me that we need to clearly identify these two lines. And the last thing is actually this concept of orange juice in a bar that was phrased differently in terms of having legal issues in Sharia or finance. And I just want to end with this is, we often use the verse of Quran, وَحَلَّ اللَّهُ الْبَيْعَ وَحَرَّمَ الرِّبَا, that Allah has permitted trade and He has forbidden riba. But for me, I think the problem that we will not go away, because it's my opinion, that because it is embedded in Quran before that. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, ذَلِكَ بِأَنَّهُمْ قَالُوا إِنَّمَا الْبَيْعُ مِثْلُ الرِّبَا. That there will be those who will say that trading is the same as riba. And I think we need to be cognizant of that, that I do not believe that we will reach a place where we will have everybody accepting what is compliant, which was the question, what is compliant in that. We need to be cognizant that if Allah said that there will be people that they will say that these two things are the same, then we must be prepared for us to always have those people. So to answer the orange juice in a bar problem, I will give them the answer of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That yes, you say what you want to say, but we have made something halal and something else. Just my, on behalf of, I took the liberty on behalf of my brothers from the practitioner universe. So please, we'll start off if anything was received negatively from them.
Well noted. I think before we get to the question, just a clarity to ensure that we're talking about cross-discipline and multidisciplinary skills here. And drawing up barriers between business practitioners and Sharia scholars becomes ineffective in the long run. Because you see almost all of these ulama are giving some level of advice on strategy as well, even though that's not the intention. But when bankers come in to ask whether I need to take this product or not, there is a certain element, and Malaysia has actually ingrained that and saying that Sharia boards need to give strategic advice. And it's a strange one, because that should be the business practitioner's responsibility. The point is, it's multidisciplinary skills that are required for contemporary Sharia scholars, not just a single skill. That needs to come up over and over again. Now, so you have a question.
Let me just say thank you very much to the organizers of this function. The convention is really something that is sorely needed in our Islamic environment. I am an insurance and finance practitioner, independent one. I've been one for the last 26 years. Prior to that, I worked in the legal profession. And I want to talk specifically about my observations in the last 26 years as a practitioner in this industry. Most of my clients are Muslims, and most of them have taqwa. All of them want to do the right thing. Most of them are looking for guidance, and actually they're looking towards the shuyukh, the leaders, in the simplest of terms, in terms of what to do. I think, Sheikh Ziyaad, you said it earlier, a lot of, there's place for robotics, but at the end of the day, nothing beats sitting with a person and getting that personal comfort of, I'm able to speak to you and connect with you so that you can reassure me that I'm doing the right thing. But I think where I'm going with all of this is, for me, the issue of simplicity in Islamic finance is something that I'd like to see come through for the man industry. Somehow or the other, we get lost in the element there's just this maze of, and I'm saying it with all the respect that I can muster to the panel on the stage. The man industry is looking for guidance. If I can think of when I was a teenager and I was extremely rebellious, there's one thing that resonated with me. Where one sheikh, he described Islam to me in the simplest of terms. He said, Islam stands for I shall love all mankind. And the penny dropped. The penny dropped immediately. And for me, I think most Muslims want to do the right thing. Most Muslims are looking for guidance. They want to do the right thing. And my request is, we need to find a way to take the element of complexity out of Islamic finance and Islamic insurance, and also the issue of the kafir. It's sorely needed, but the rates, is harder than what you find in the market. So it's certainly something that needs to be spoken about. And the reality is, again, the man in the street wants to do the right thing. Is it affordable? Is he allowed? We need direction.
Well,
Shukran.
We have another question. Easy question.
My first statement was I'm going to support Dr. Ziyaad and in his plight to make it difficult. So my question, I'm taking advantage of the fact that I have before me not only Sharia scholars, but those who have been in the industry for quite some time and who have expertise. And I found, okay, now we are actually at an event speaking about sustainability. And there is a very huge issue, and Dr. Ziyaad already asked this question, but unfortunately it wasn't answered. So I'm going to try and be a little bit more direct. My question is, looking at the issue of credit scoring again, we are trying to implement maqasid al-sharia in the best possible way that we can, and there are alternatives which other countries have already come up for credit scoring methods that do not look at debt specifically. For example, the AFSG in China that have come up with a credit scoring method that looks at spending habits and interactions on the internet and such things. So this would require the usage of artificial intelligence and technology. So this method of credit scoring is in tune with the maqasid of Sharia, which is adl, which is inclusivity, getting rid of debt as much as we possibly can, and circulation of wealth. So it already fits all of the boxes. We haven't yet adopted this, and I do understand that it is a technical issue that the tech geniuses obviously have to implement. But globally, there is one issue that is currently being faced when it comes to AI and this type of application or this type of development, and that is the issue of it's a very ethical issue where the AI is biased. Right? So we haven't actually addressed that yet because we haven't reached that stage. But my question to the ulama on stage is, how would we potentially address the issue of AI bias, number one, and number two, what are the other potential issues that we could possibly face, jurisprudential issues, in applying such type of technology in credit scoring?
Yeah. We have just 2 minutes to answer that question. I'm watching Shaykh Ziyaad there, so who would like to take that? Shaykh Bilal.
AI is an entire universe of its own. The question will be, will the AI reduce, I'll answer the question with the question, will it reduce the bias of human beings? If it's improving, if you're going to be going towards an area of improvement, then well and good, it's excellent, from my perspective at least. If we are going backwards, if we are retrogressing, then definitely, then it means the technology doesn't work. So if it works, then it's well and good. But again, just to reiterate what we did mention with regards to the maqasid, and it's about the degrees of excellence. So if, as time progresses, we are improving, in terms of the allocation of capital, in terms of the distribution of resources, in terms of the type of development and growth that's achieved, then it's laudable. And whatever efforts in that direction, that will be welcome. I just to quickly touch on the point that was raised by the brother about expensiveness. Personally, I haven't seen that. I think we're now at a stage of maturity, and there are experts around the room. There's many practitioners, brokers, etc. So from what I have experienced personally as a businessman in making use of various, because we also don't want to have to pay extra to follow our Islamic. So whether it's on the financial side or the quality of investment services, expense cost of those services, or whether it's on the takaful side, I think we're now at a level where not only are we competitive, I think sometimes we can get far better service and better products from our Islamic financial institutions. That's my personal experience.
I'm getting a sign that says time up at the back. So, Yusuf, you have less than a minute.
It's a very, very pertinent question. I would just like to give a heads up for another issue when AI is involved, apart from this decision bias. I had the opportunity to look at one of the alternative credit scoring mechanism by a company, from the same company, and he was showing me the demo. Like it can read through all the WhatsApp messages, then through the calls and everything. Everything is everything. So I think that's something that scholars need to look at. This is of course when we are talking about big data mining, when you are able to pinpoint every single action of the person and making this small device as a surveillance tool and everything. I think this is where we also need to look at the hadith where Prophet on the day on the Hajjatul Wada, he mentioned that your wealth, your a'rad, is all haram for everyone. So would the data in today's context would be considered as part of a'rad as well? That's the question I would like to ask you. Thank you.
Did a master's thesis in AI and Sharia. So you better, everyone is very careful. Jazakallah khair. It was very enlightening. We've learned a lot as students from our honorable teachers and scholars. We hope that the session was beneficial for you. Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.